All right, without further ado, I'm going to pass things off to Nathaniel.
Thank you, Shannon. And thank you all so much for joining us. Gosh, we have a huge crowd here, and I am so excited to introduce all of you to the Environmental Voter Project. We're going to go through every aspect of our work today, and then, as Shannon mentioned, have a wonderful Q&A session at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And for those of you who are just joining us, uh, my name is Nathaniel Stinnett, and I am the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And you are here today to learn about this wonderful nonprofit, the Environmental Voter Project. And the way we're going to go through this presentation today is first, I'm going to discuss what we do at the Environmental Voter Project and why that's our particular focus. Second, I'm going to get into the how of what we do. So in particular, how we identify non-voting environmentalists and then how we mobilize them. Third, I'm going to go through some of our results, of which we're very proud. And then fourth, the opportunities for you to get involved in our work as a volunteer or as a donor. And then finally, we will have a Q&A session, but as Shannon mentioned, if you have questions as we're going through the presentation, please feel free to put them in the Q&A folder. All right, let's go ahead and get started. In a nutshell, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on what you see right in front of you. And that is, we identify non-voting environmentalists, and then we turn them into consistent voters. That's it. That's what we focus on. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. Now, what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that most environmental voter projects do focus their work on. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even, as odd as this might sound, try to convince people to care more about climate change or other environmental issues. In fact, a really good way to think about the niche that we occupy is we're not even in the mind changing or opinion changing business at all. We don't want to change people's minds. Instead, we want to find the people whose minds don't need to be changed because they're already with us. They care so much about climate and other environmental issues that it's their number one priority over all other else. Yet they don't vote. And so what they need is not to have their minds changed or opinions changed, but rather have their behavior changed. And that is the most important thing to understand about the unique nature of our work at the Environmental Voter Project. We are a behavior change organization that is focused on finding super environmentalists who are already persuaded yet not voting, and then turning them into better voters. And the reason we have this particular focus is because the climate movement simply does not have the political power that we need. I know that's something that's uncomfortable to talk about. A lot of people like to pound their chest and pretend like their issue is so powerful. And why can't people just understand that they should support what we support? Well, we're not interested in saying things that feel good at the Environmental Voter Project. We want to accurately diagnose the most important problems that we face and try to overcome them. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the single most important problems we face in the climate movement, if not the most important problem, is something that's reflected in this poll that you see right here. Now, this particular poll was taken during the run-up to the midterm elections in 2022. It was a poll of likely voters in battleground states, and they were asked what their top three issue priorities were. 15% listed climate or other environmental issues. Now, the good news is that's higher than you would have gotten if you had dropped a poll in 2018 or 2014 during those midterm elections. But the bad news is that is nowhere near where we need it to be if we want politicians to pay attention to our concerns. The simple truth is that if only 15% of likely voters list an issue among their top 3 priorities, that's not enough to get politicians to spend their political capital on it. That's not enough to get politicians to run on climate or the environment, let alone win on it. And in that same poll, if you narrow the question down to people's number 1 priority, unfortunately, the picture is even bleaker. Only 4% of likely voters in battleground states in 2022 listed climate as their number 1 priority. And the reason this is such an important problem for us to face is when only 4% of voters list an issue as their number 1 priority, not only does it make it really hard to elect climate leaders in particular elections, but even when we do elect the so-called right people, boy, is it hard for them to justify spending their precious political capital on the thing that only 4% of voters list as their top priority. We all know that it isn't like once somebody wins an election, they can just snap their fingers and get whatever they want, right? They need to pick and choose what to spend their precious political capital on, and they ain't going to spend it on the thing that only 4% of voters have on the top of their minds when they go into the ballot box. And I know this is just one poll, but I promise you, we're not cherry picking anything. You look at any election, whether it's President of the United States or Boise, Idaho City Council or anything in between, and you ask voters what their top priorities are, and far, far too few of them will list climate and environmental issues. And maybe you're saying, oh, well, Nathaniel, I keep on reading about polls where majorities of Americans want government to lead on climate change or clean energy or address the climate crisis. And that's not wrong. Most voters do prefer government action on climate change. But there's a big, big difference between voter preferences and voter priorities. Just because a bunch of voters care about something doesn't mean they care a lot about it. And I know that might sound like a small linguistic difference, but in the policy and political world, it is everything. Just imagine this. Imagine a poll that said 80% of Americans want to get rid of daylight savings, which is probably pretty accurate, okay? Does that mean that the next presidential election is going to be decided on the one issue of whether to get rid of daylight savings time or not? No, because it is not a salient issue. It is not an extremely important issue for many voters at all. And unfortunately, climate change isn't that far different. Sure, a whole bunch of voters would prefer government action to address climate change, but very, very few prioritize it as a top issue. And the reason this is such a big deal, the reason this is such an important problem to overcome, and why we at the Environmental Voter Project want to overcome this problem, is illustrated in this slide here. And this is the point where I'm going to ask you to pay particular attention, because I'm going to say something that a lot of Americans don't know, yet it's a crucially important aspect of how all campaigns are run and how all policy is made. And that is this. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. So important, I'm going to say it again. Whether you vote or not is public record. So, what does that mean if someone is running for governor or mayor or president? Well, I'll tell you what it means, because I've run a whole bunch of campaigns. It means the first thing any candidate does or any campaign does is they open up their laptops and they look at public voter files and they make a very important decision. And that is, with limited time and limited money, who are we going to talk to and who are we not going to talk to? It is the single most important decision any campaign makes. And you better believe that if there is a public file showing the history of every single registered voter in what elections they voted and what elections they don't vote in, well, that's going to be important data for the campaign to look at, right? And sure enough, that's what takes place in that first meeting. They look at these public voter files and they say, oh, here's a whole bunch of people who aren't registered to vote. Forget them. Here are some people who are registered to vote. Oh, but it looks like they've never actually cast a ballot. Forget them too. Let's say it's a gubernatorial campaign. Well, if it's a gubernatorial campaign, maybe you find some people who only vote in presidential elections. Probably going to forget them too, unless you have an abundance of money and an abundance of time. No, you're going to focus on the people who have a history of voting in gubernatorial elections and people who even vote in local elections. And not to put too fine a point on it, but we literally know who these people are by name and street address. And so what that means is that if you are a candidate for any office, big and small, you will almost always focus on likely voters. Now, sometimes if you have tons of money and tons of time, you'll start talking to less likely voters. But at least at the very beginning, your main focus will be talking to people who have a public history of voting in the election that you're trying to win. And so what that also means is, who do you think your campaign is going to poll? Are they going to poll the non-voters who have a history of not showing up and casting a ballot in the campaign you're trying to win? No, they're going to ignore those people. Those people's priorities, those people's issues, those people's opinions don't matter. Only the voters' opinions matter. And I haven't been doing this long enough that I can't like hear the cynicism in what I just said. Like I get how deeply cynical that sounds, but just think about it for a second. If you have a record of who votes in elections and who doesn't, and in particular, who votes in the elections that you as a candidate are trying to win, of course you're going to pay more attention to those people than the people who have a history of not voting. And so what this means is that polls like the ones that I just showed you, that show 4% of likely voters, of consistent voters, list climate and environmental issues as their top priority, it means this is bad news. This is not good for the climate movement. Because again, campaigns and policymakers know who votes and who doesn't vote. And when you look at the people who vote, far, far, far too few of them prioritize the issues that all of us care deeply about. All right, I promise this isn't all going to be doom and gloom, but like a lot of nonprofits, we are trying to solve a problem. And in this particular instance, I wanted to define the problem, which is this enormous lack of political power in the climate movement that largely stems from the fact that too few voters prioritize the issues we care most about. All right, so looking at this problem, why do we, the Environmental Voter Project, decide, okay, let's find lots of non-voters who care about the environment and turn them into better voters? Well, the reason we focus on that particular solution is because as we researched more and more polling data and predictive modeling data and voter registration data, we came to realize something really interesting was going on. And that is this. The reason so few voters care deeply about climate and the environment is not because too few Americans do. If instead of just looking at likely voters, we broaden our aperture, we step back and look at a bigger population of potential voters, like say all registered voters or all adults, it turns out huge numbers of them care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their number one priority. We're talking about tens of millions of people. So why aren't they showing up in polls like this, polls of likely voters? Well, for one really clear and important reason. Environmentalists aren't voting. No, it turns out that there are tens of millions of non-voting environmentalists. And that's why when we look at polls of likely voters, of consistent voters, if we put ourselves in the mindset of a candidate or a campaign that's trying to win an election, a lot of these climate first Americans don't show up. for the simple fact that they don't vote. What we came to realize at the Environmental Voter Project is that the climate movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem. Our people aren't voting. And that is why we at the Environmental Voter Project are so laser focused, not on trying to change people's minds to get them to care more about climate and the environment, but instead to find these non-voters who care deeply about climate and the environment and turning them into better voters. Now, I realized I just made a big assertion, so let me get into some of the numbers. When I say lots of climate first Americans and lots of environmentalists aren't voting, this is what I mean. Over the last 4 major federal elections, you'll see we've identified millions of already registered voters who list climate or the environment as their #1 issue priority, who just don't vote on election day. Over 8 million in the 2020 presidential election and over 13 million in the 2022 midterms. And a little bit later on, I'm going to get into how we came up with these numbers, and you'll see our research behind it. But these are enormous, enormous numbers of non-voting environmentalists. And I imagine some of you are looking at this and you're shaking your head and you're saying, oh my God, why aren't these environmentalists voting? And I get it. I get why it can be frustrating. But what I'd like to suggest to you is that this is an enormous opportunity because we live at a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds or opinions about anything, especially things related to climate change. And what these huge populations of people represent are people who don't need their minds changed at all. No, they are already with us. These are people who you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. They're just not voting. These people don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course, it's not easy. But what it is easier and cheaper than trying to change minds and opinions. And perhaps most importantly, it's something that is testable. Because remember what I said, whether you vote or not is public record. And so you can run experiments figuring out how to get these non-voting environmentalists to the polls and double down on the messages that work and forget about the messages that don't work, which is something that is much, much harder to do when you're trying to change people's minds because you can never sneak into the ballot box and see if you have changed their minds. You can only measure whether you've changed their behavior. And so this is the opportunity that we are trying to take advantage of at the Environmental Voter Project. We are trying to dramatically increase the climate movement's political power in every election, federal, state, and local. And we think that the easiest, cheapest, most efficient way to do it is not to change people's minds, but rather to find the people who don't need their minds changed and just figure out how to get them to the polls. And I'm going to get into how we do that, but I just want one more slide to further define this problem, this environmental voter turnout problem that we've been discussing. Remember that set of polls that I was showing you earlier? Well, elsewhere in that same survey, so remember, this is a survey of likely voters in battleground states in the 2022 midterms. A question was asked, what is your #1 most important criteria when choosing a candidate? And you'll see here, this data shows people who said climate change is the single most important factor. And so you'll see in Nevada here, 5% of likely voters said climate change was the #1 priority when choosing a candidate. Not bad, right? Like it to be higher, but not bad. But look at unlikely voters in Nevada. Look at low propensity voters, people who are registered but rarely actually cast a ballot. 10% of them, twice as many, say climate is their #1 priority when choosing a candidate. Twice as many. Look at Pennsylvania, another very important battleground state. Again, 3% of likely voters say climate's their #1 priority when choosing a candidate. 7% of unlikely voters do. This is the same story in almost every state that we look at. Low propensity voters are much, much more likely to list climate as a top priority. And this again illustrates this enormous pool of potential political power that we have in low propensity voters. This is why we at the Environmental Voter Project are so laser focused on turnout, on finding these dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who aren't voting and then turning them into consistent voters. All right, this is how we do it. It's a 4-step process. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on all of these in the slides that follow, but just right up front, the first step is identification. We work with data scientists to build what's called predictive models. And I'm going to describe this in a bit more detail in the slides that follow. But for now, just know what this technique allows us to do is individually identify voters in voter files. So as individuals, not as demographic groups, but as individuals who have a very high likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but literally listing it as their #1 priority over all other issues. Then, once we've isolated these climate first registered voters, remember what I said before, whether you vote or not is public record. And so we can just get rid of the people who have a good voting history, who we think are already likely to show up, and instead just concentrate on these super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. That brings us to step 2, mobilization. We work with thousands of volunteers around the country to canvass and call and postcard these voters. We also, as a staff, put together sophisticated mail and digital ad campaigns, all focused on just one thing, and that is turning these non-voting environmentalists into new voters and then into consistent voters. And the special thing here is that, remember, we have already identified people who are likely to list climate as their #1 priority. So we don't need to waste any of our messaging time or space or money trying to educate these people on climate issues or trying to persuade them to care about climate. No, they're already there. And so this enables us to be completely agnostic with our messaging. We can just focus on whatever message gets these people to the polls. Even if it's talking about chocolate chip cookies, we can talk about chocolate chip cookies to get them to the polls. And so what we do is we run hundreds of what are called randomized control trials, kind of the gold standard of behavioral science experiments, figuring out which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to get them to the polls. That brings us to step 3, habit reinforcement. Remember the problem we're trying to solve here. We are trying to dramatically increase the number of climate first voters in every election, federal, state, and local. And so what that means is we don't just mobilize in the big, sexy federal elections that happen every 2 or 4 years. You don't need to be a behavioral scientist to guess that's not a very good way to change people's habits, only talking to them once every 2 or 4 years. No, we take habit reinforcement seriously. And what that means is we view every election, no matter how small, as a precious opportunity to change people's habits, to change their voting behavior. Last year in 2023, an odd year when a lot of groups weren't doing any voter mobilization at all, we were active in over 210 elections. And that's not because all of them were important for environmental policymaking. I freely admit that many of them weren't. But every single one of them was crucially important when it comes to changing people's voting behavior. Our philosophy at the Environmental Voter Project is how dare we let a single election pass us by in the states where we work without using it as an opportunity to communicate with these low propensity environmental voters to change their habits and turn them into an unstoppable block of super voters who are demanding climate leadership. Because ultimately, that's what step 4 is about. It is about changing the electorate. Our ultimate goal at the Environmental Voter Project is to make it hard for anybody to run for anything anywhere without saying, holy moly, where did all these environmental voters come from? Because ultimately, That is what drives the political decision making more than anything. Even in this hyper partisan world that we live in right now, there is still one thing, believe it or not, there is still one thing that unites all Democrats and Republicans, and that is this. Boy, do they all like winning elections. I promise you, they all love winning elections. Nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so at the Environmental Voter Project, we aren't trying to persuade people to lead on climate out of the goodness of their heart and then just cross our fingers and hope it all works out. No, we want to build political power so that we can bully politicians into doing what's right. We want to make it so that the only way to win an election is by leading on climate. And the best way to do that is to build an unstoppable block of climate voters wherever we can. All right, now I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about step one and then a bit more about step two, and then we can get to some of our results. So I told you that we build predictive models to identify these environment first voters. And for some of you, that might have made sense. For others, you probably thought, I have no idea what that means. So I'm going to tell you what that means. It starts with us doing a poll, but this isn't your typical political poll. This is an enormous poll of 10, 15, 20,000 people, but we can get away with it without it costing too much because we're really only asking one question, and that is, what is your number one most important political priority? And let's say in a state like Pennsylvania, we ask 10,000 people what their number one priority is, and 1,000 of them list climate change or clean air or clean water, some environmental issue. Well, then it's really easy to isolate those people who have just self-identified as climate first registered voters and figure out what we know about them. What data is there on voter files? What census data is there? What publicly available behavioral and consumer data is there? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of it out there. And what this allows us to do is work with data scientists and figure out who are the other people in Pennsylvania who are just like these people in our poll who said that climate is their number one priority. And there are lots of different clusters, lots of different profiles that will pop up. But what we can do is we can look through the whole voter file and try to find other people like them and try to find predictive data points that help us identify these people. And some of those data points might be what you see right here. Maybe if you're a forestry employee, you're 11 times more likely than the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as your top priority. Or maybe if you just bought a new home and you have no kids, you're 6 times as likely as the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as a top priority. Maybe basketball fans care more about climate than baseball, hockey, or football fans. Or maybe if you're a gun control supporter, that correlates with caring deeply about the environment often. Or maybe people who buy exercise magazines and other health products are twice as likely as the average Pennsylvanian. Now, none of these data points are predictive on their own. But when you put them together into clusters, as I mentioned earlier, it makes it really easy to start finding other people who have a very high likelihood of also listing climate and the environment as their top priority. And it's a long, iterative process. But at the end of it, what we are able to do is assign a score from 0 to 100 to every single individual voter in a state's voter file, telling us not how much they care about climate and the environment, but rather how likely they are to literally list it as their number one priority over all other issues. And what you're looking at here is that score distribution for the state of Pennsylvania. This is every single voter in Pennsylvania. And as you'll see, millions of them have a less than 30% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. No surprise there, right? And then there's a whole bunch in the mushy middle. You can't really tell. Are they likely to? Are they not likely to? Who knows? But then look over here. There are a whole bunch, over 1 million, who have a greater than 85% likelihood of caring so deeply about climate and other environmental issues that it is their number one priority over all other issues. And once we are able to isolate these people building these predictive models, the last step is we say, thank you very much, data scientists, and we ship out this list of the top 15% and ask an outside polling shop to poll them and ask them an open-ended question. Hey, what's your number one most important political priority? And every time we've done that, at least 85% have said, oh, climate change. Why do you ask? That's how precise this predictive modeling is. And I say this not to illustrate that we're good or bad or indifferent at this. We aren't the only organization that does this. This is how sophisticated political campaigns like presidential and US Senate and gubernatorial campaigns now target voters. And this is how precise this technique has gotten. And so this is how we are able to identify people who have a stratospherically high likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but literally listing it as their number one priority. And then remember what I've now said a few times. Whether you vote or not is public record. So once we isolate these people with a high likelihood of listing climate as their top priority, it's then very easy to determine which of them vote and which of them don't. And right here, you are looking at a map of the 46,381 registered voters in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority, yet they skipped the 2020 presidential election and haven't voted in a single election since then. So we have to assume that they are unlikely to vote in the fall of 2024. These are our targets in Philadelphia. And not to put too fine a point on it, but we literally know them by name and street address. And we have telephone numbers for most of them because that's the data in the voter file where we have built these scores. This is how we are able to identify these non-voting environmentalists. Now, does this mean we have spoken to every single voter in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania and had them tell us that climate's their number one priority? No, we haven't. We have built a predictive model, a model that helps us predict who is likely to list climate as a top priority. But as I've just said, these are frighteningly accurate models. Then we are able to go to that step 2, mobilization. And as I mentioned, we work with now over 6,000 volunteers to canvass, call, and postcard these voters. We send digital ads and direct mail to them, all with behavioral science-informed messaging that is proven to increase turnout. And I'm going to get into some of those results in the next few slides. But just to say a word or two about our messaging, remember what I said earlier about how once you identify these people who are already dyed-in-the-wool persuaded climate voters, you don't need to then talk to them about climate unless that's a good way to get them to vote? Well, it turns out that the messaging we have found, and that a lot of behavioral sociologists and behavioral economists and behavioral psychologists have found, works best in getting people to vote, usually does not involve rationally convincing a voter of the importance of voting, or even talking about an issue that they care about. And this leads to one of the most counterintuitive aspects about the Environmental Voter Project. We are an environmental nonprofit that almost never talks about climate or the environment. For a pretty good reason, I think. And that is, it doesn't really work that well at getting people to vote. Instead, once we've identified these climate first, low propensity voters, the things that work best are little societal nudges, little things like peer pressure, little things like getting people at the door or over the phone to say that they're likely to vote, because we know that even non-voters will usually tell a stranger, oh yeah, I'm going to vote, and then trying to keep them to that promise. Maybe many of you have volunteered for campaigns before where you've gone to someone's door and you've said, oh, do you intend to vote in the election? They say, oh, yeah, I'm going to vote. Maybe they even write it down. They sign their name to a pledge card. Well, that's magic, because that is like a trap closing on them. Because what that allows you to do is then right before election day, call them back up and say, hey, I just want to remind you, a few months ago, you said that you were going to vote. And well, the election's on Tuesday. And that's your opportunity to follow through on your promise, which we know is important to you. And now, instead of your message being trying to convince someone of the importance of their one vote over a denominator of millions, instead, you're doing something much more powerful, which is equating the act of voting with whether they're an honest person who keeps their promises or not. Believe me, that sends turnout through the roof, as I'm about to show you. These are the types of messaging that we use, and we run hundreds of experiments to figure out what works best with the various demographic groups within our target voters. All right, now I'm going to get to some of the results. The first way that we measure our impact is with something called randomized control trials. Very briefly, this is what happens. Let's take Pennsylvania as an example again. Let's say we've identified 1 million unlikely to vote environmentalists in Pennsylvania. 1 million. What we do not do is immediately start messaging to all 1 million of them. Instead, before we talk to a single voter, we randomly separate them into 2 groups. The first one, which usually has about 80 or 85% of the population, is called a treatment or intervention group. The second one is a control group that has about 15 or 20% of that original population. That control group, we set it aside and we never talk to those voters. Then the remaining 85% in the treatment group, those are the ones who get our behavioral science informed canvassing and calling and postcarding and direct mail and digital ads. All right, then the election happens. Now, for probably the 4th or 5th time, I'm going to remind you that whether you vote or not is public record. And so what that means is, shortly after the election, voter files are updated, and we can see how many low propensity environmental voters actually voted in our treatment group and compare it to how many actually voted in our control group, who we did not talk to. And this really special process allows us to isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Because as long as the numbers are big enough, and as long as this separation process was truly random, we've controlled for anything else that could impact turnout. So like if it was raining in Pittsburgh and that depressed turnout in Pittsburgh, well, there's roughly the same percentage of Pittsburgh residents in our treatment group as in our control group. We've controlled for that. Or if the Biden campaign spends $1 billion in Pennsylvania mobilizing voters, well, we've controlled for that. Unless they hacked into our system and decided to only talk to people in our treatment group and not people in our control group, we have controlled for that. And just over the last, say, 3.5 years, in the 19 states that you see here, we've probably been active in close to 900 elections. And we've probably increased turnout in almost every single one of them. But in many of them, the numbers of people we were communicating with were so small that we couldn't get those randomized control trials to show what's called statistically significant results. We could see that there was an increase in turnout, but we couldn't prove that it wasn't due to random occurrence. But in a whole bunch of elections, dozens of them, we did get statistically significant results, which, as a reminder, proves that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout among these low propensity environmental voters while controlling for all outside variables. And as you'll see, in 2020, 2021, 22, and through the first half of 2023, because we're still waiting for voter files to be updated, we were solely responsible for increasing turnout among these low propensity environmental voters, as much as 1.8 percentage points in general elections, as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 5 percentage points in local elections. These might not seem like terribly big numbers, but believe me, in politics, they are everything. They are everything. Ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.8% is in Pennsylvania, and he'll tell you. These are big deal numbers. All right. That's the first way that we measure our impact on turnout. The second way that we measure our impact on turnout is over the long term. Since we first launched our proof of concept just in Boston a little over 7 years ago, we have further expanded to 19 states. And through about 10 months ago, which was the last time we did one of these longitudinal measurements, we had communicated with over 9.5 million unique individual environment first voters, all of whom, by definition, were unlikely to vote in an election or we wouldn't have been talking to them, right? Well, we've tracked those people over time. We've tagged them in voter files and followed up. And as of February or March of 2023, almost 1.5 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. They had become such consistent voters that if you were running for dog catcher or library trustee, you would look at the voter file and you'd say, yep, got to talk to that person because they're definitely going to vote. We should poll them too to figure out what issues they care about. This is the metric of which we are most proud because this shows that we are helping to build that unstoppable block of climate first voters. However, I do want to make one caveat. This second metric, this multi-year metric, is different from the previous one I mentioned. It's different from randomized control trials. For randomized control trials, we can prove that we're solely responsible for those increases in turnout. For this long-term metric, we can't claim that we're solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters. For a whole bunch of reasons, it's very hard to run longitudinal multi-year randomized control trials when you're trying to right-size your target universes for particular elections. But what I can say is that we're pretty darn responsible for this. There's no other organization that's now been active in almost 2,000 elections over the past 7 years. And we're very, very proud of these results. All right, I'm going to get to the finish here. We've been getting a whole bunch of attention for our cutting edge data science and behavioral science approach to getting these environmentalists to vote. All of these outlets here ran special features of us recently. We're very, very grateful for all of the wonderful press that we've been getting. And we would love to have you join our work. As we look ahead to 2024, we will be working in these 19 states that you see here. Many of them are purple states, but you'll also notice some red states and some blue states. And what these states represent are places where we've identified huge numbers of non-voting environmentalists, and also states where there are lots of elections that happen each year, which means not only do we have a big target population, but we have lots of opportunities to turn them from non-voters into consistent voters. So these are the states where we feel that we can make the most difference. Does that mean we're leaving out some other very important states? Yeah, there's no doubt that like Wisconsin and Michigan are really important states, but those are states where actually the Environmental Voter Project can't make as big a difference as some other organizations. Whereas in the green states that you see here, places like Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, Pennsylvania, man, if properly funded with enough volunteers, we can continue to get these great results that we've been getting and blow the doors off turnout in the environmental movement. And so you'll see this year we are targeting 4.8 million people who are registered to vote. They have at least an 85% likelihood of listing climate or other environmental issues as their top priority, yet they are unlikely to vote this fall without a sophisticated mobilization campaign getting them to the polls. These are the people we are targeting. And just to give you a snapshot of some of the more battlegroundy states, you'll see in Arizona, we've identified almost 230,000 of these low propensity environmental voters who we'll be targeting. What does that mean in the context of Arizona? Well, it's over 20 times the margin of victory in 2020 in that state in the 2020 presidential election. which was barely 10,000 votes. Look at Georgia. We're targeting almost 500,000 of these already registered climate first, low propensity environmental voters. This is the huge opportunity that we have in the climate movement if we focus on not persuading new people to care about climate. Of course, that's important, but instead focus on the people who are already with us. They're just not voting. And so these are the people who we will be targeting this year. And we would love to have you join our work. First, we want you to volunteer. You can go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved and sign up to volunteer. One way you can help mobilize these voters is by joining phone banks. We have multiple phone banks listed on our website for you to sign up for each week. Every single phone bank begins with a training. And then once you're trained, you can call on your own whenever you want. We'll give you the scripts, we'll give you the numbers, we'll give you the materials. Your phone number will be anonymized. And perhaps most importantly, we will give you a script that has been proven in one of those randomized control trials to increase turnout. We know it works. We never, ever, ever ask a volunteer to do anything unless we have proof that it has increased turnout in the past. Some of you might be thinking, oh, I don't know, I don't feel very comfortable calling people on the phone. Give it a shot. Give it a shot. This is not trying to strong arm someone to support a particular candidate or start caring about an issue that they don't care about. This is just getting people who are already with us to get to the polls. These calls are a lot easier than most people imagine, and once you get used to it, people love it. Second thing, door-to-door canvassing. We are currently running canvassing efforts in Austin, Texas, Tucson, Arizona, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we may soon be launching canvassing efforts in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Similar to our calls, we only give you scripts that are proven to work. We start every canvassing shift out with a training, and once you're trained, we can give you the materials to train on your own. And even in this modern day environment with all these crazy tech tools that help you contact voters, the truth is, knocking on someone's door and having a face-to-face conversation with them remains the single most effective way to turn non-voters into new voters. Finally, third, if you want to sign up to write postcards to these non-voting environmentalists, encouraging them to vote, we run 4 to 6 campaigns each year. You will find the next set of campaigns on our website shortly. If you haven't written postcards with the Environmental Voter Project before, we ask you to join an online orientation webinar. We will then send you the postcards. We will send you the text to write on the postcards. We will send you the voter list to send them to. And if you want stamps, we'll send you those too. And the reason we're so precise with our postcard design and our postcard text is because, yes, you guessed it, we don't ask you to do anything unless we have shown in a previous experiment that it increases turnout. And so we know what postcard designs and texts work, and we send it to you so you get it right and know that your time is actually making a difference. So please join us in volunteering for these efforts. Finally, I'll just say, take a moment right now to support our work. We have identified 4.8 million of these low propensity environment first voters. We literally know them by name and street address on voter files. We have run hundreds of randomized control trials showing us which messages work best to turn them into voters. So we know our targets. We know what works. Now all we need are the volunteers and the funding to make it happen. And you are here for a reason. You've outed yourselves. You are here because you care deeply about the climate crisis, or you care deeply about the democracy crisis, or both. You're here because you want to make a difference. And we are offering you a way to make a difference. Last year, over 8,000 people made a donation to support our work. We can't do what we do without your support. So please take a moment to go to environmentalvoter.org/donate and make a donation. You can also find information there about making a donation by check or wire transfer or stock gift. You can also sign up for monthly donations. Monthly donations are great for a lot of people because you can spread out your donations over time. And they're also great for us because remember, we are about building good voting habits. And so we work year round in every election to turn non-voters into new voters. And this year-round work requires year-round funding. The final thing that I'll just say is if you're interested in hosting an online event for your friends or colleagues, please email us at info@environmentalvoter.org. We want to hear from you. We want to walk through with you what one of these events might be like, and we would love to pitch our work to them and to get more people supporting our work and volunteering for our work. And so thank you for joining us today. I am so grateful that you're taking an interest in our cutting edge work. And I really, really hope to see your donation come through or to see you on a phone bank or at a canvas or at a postcarding party sometime soon. Take care. And now we will have our Q&A session.
All right, we got a few questions. I'm going to jump right into it. Why are we only focused on #1 priority environmentalists and not top 3, top 5?
Really, really great question. So there are a few reasons. First off, when we started at the Environmental Voter Project, we targeted people who listed climate or the environment as one of their top 2 priorities. But slowly but surely in our research, we realized the number of people who listed as their #1 priority was getting so large that we could afford to just focus on them. Now, to be clear, if we mobilized people who listed climate and the environment as one of their top 2 priorities, of course, we would have a much bigger target population. But the simple truth is, we have not gotten anywhere close to exhausting our ability to mobilize climate first non-voters. And just to give you an idea of what I mean by that, we are currently working with a $3.8 million budget this year to mobilize those 4.8 million low propensity environmental voters. We think, by looking back at previous randomized control trials, that we could spend as much as $11.5 million this year just on those 4.8 million voters before we begin to reach a point of diminishing returns. So we are nowhere close to even reaching a point of a slight bit of inefficiency on our current targets. And we want to get there before we expand it even more. The second reason is this. We want to make sure that every single person we get to the polls has climate change at the front of their mind, not immigration, not the economy, not anything else. That's not to say there aren't other important issues out there. Of course there are. But we feel like the single most efficient use of your money and your time is to first mobilize these people. Then, if we have too much money, we'll start branching out. Great, great question.
All right. Did EVP consider temporarily adding states this year, like just for 2024, since some of them are really, really important?
Very, very good question. And, I'm going to answer this with more certainty than there actually is in my head. Obviously, these are things that we struggle with. Oh my God, do we recognize the historic importance of 2024? And we recognize that we are not working in certain states that will be crucially important, like a Wisconsin or a Michigan, or states that have important climate ballot questions like California and Washington. But because of what I just said, because we are nowhere close to reaching a point of diminishing returns in our current 19 states, and because we choose states based on where we think we could have the biggest return, it didn't make sense for us to expand into new states and be less impactful than we could be in our current states. Because it is always important for all of us at EVP, not just me, but every single member of the staff and the board and our volunteers to be able to say that we are having maximum impact in our states. And so I will tell you, there are probably those of you who listening to this right now who really care about Wisconsin or Michigan. And I can't blame you. And what I'm going to tell you is we are not the most efficient use of your time or money in those states. And I wouldn't want to be working in those states and put myself in a position of trying to convince you to fund or spend your time on something that is less efficient than some other groups work. And so by all means, if you're interested in states where we aren't working, I encourage you to support other groups' great work. But in these 19 states where we work, I can tell you we know how to turn these non-voters into voters, and I am convinced that we are a very efficient use of your time and money.
One more question here. Why aren't these environmentalists voting, Nathaniel?
Yeah, why aren't they voting? Very, very good question. I'm going to be able to answer you in some ways that are certain and other ways that are uncertain. So first, let me tell you what we're uncertain about. Social scientists are very good at figuring out how to get people to do things, how to put together experiments to figure out how to get people to vote or eat healthy or exercise. What they're not good at is figuring out why people don't do things, like vote. It's hard. It's hard to precisely measure why environmentalists don't vote. Really, the only thing you can do, the only tool social scientists have in that situation, is to ask them, is to poll people and say, hey, why don't you vote? And this weird thing happens when you ask people why they aren't doing something that society views as important. And that is that they lie their pants off. It's called a social desirability response bias. But that's a fancy way of saying when you ask people why they're not doing something that everybody else thinks is important, they lie. They tell you what they think is the most socially acceptable excuse for not doing that thing that society views as important. So I could tell you a lot of the excuses that environmentalists give for not voting, but for a whole bunch of reasons, we don't necessarily buy many of those excuses. And I encourage you to go to our reports tab, our reports and studies tab on our website, and you can look at some of our research. We've actually done a lot of research on why people lie about not voting, and you might find it very interesting. But very briefly, I do want to tell you what we do know. One, we do know that these climate first registered voters are disproportionately young, they're disproportionately people of color, and they're disproportionately lower income. So the first thing that we know about why these environmentalists are less likely to vote than other registered voters is a mere demographic correlation. Young people, people of color, and lower income people just vote less often. And often they are voting less often because of voter suppression efforts. No matter where you are, if there is a government entity that is trying to make it harder for someone to vote, chances are they are targeting young people, poor people, or people of color. So that's the first reason. The second thing is we know that for decades, generations, I would even say, the environmental movement has been oddly apolitical. And I know that some people bristle when they hear me say that. So let me explain what I mean by that. When I was growing up, what it meant to be a good environmentalist was pick up your litter or recycle. More recently, if you ask people what it means to be a good environmentalist, they'll probably say, change what you eat, change how you get to work, change the electricity you consume. Now, I don't poo-poo any of this stuff. It's all very impactful behaviors, but they're all strangely apolitical, right? Like you would never hear someone who cares deeply about reproductive rights talk like that. You would never hear someone who cares deeply about gun control talk like that. And the simple truth is that we in the environmental movement often think of environmental action in completely apolitical ways. And that's by design. For decades now, the fossil fuel industry has run very sophisticated, well-funded PR campaigns essentially trying to convince us to not pay attention to that coal-fired power plant back there, and instead it's all your fault for having a plastic water bottle in your hand. It's your personal behavior that is the problem, not our systemic pollution. And that has made our movement largely apolitical. And that's the second reason why we think that there is this turnout problem in the climate movement. But what's most important isn't that we know why environmentalists aren't voting. It's to know how to get them to vote. And that brings us back to our results and all of our experiments at the Environmental Voter Project. We are laser focused on figuring out how to identify these non-voting environmentalists and then turn them into more consistent voters. And I encourage you to go to environmentalvoter.org, look at our research. There's a lot of great messaging experiments that might be able to inform many of the organizations that many of you might be involved with, and we love to share that research with people. And we're past time. We've gone over an hour now. So I will just say, if you have further questions, please email us at info@environmentalvoter.org. And I will also encourage you to go into the chat and click on the links there right now. Click on the Get Involved page and sign up to volunteer. Click on the donate link. The one thing that we will never, ever get back in 2024 is the time that we have right now to make a difference. Use it. Make a donation. Fund our work. Sign up to volunteer. We would love to have you join our efforts. So thank you all so much. Thank you to Shannon for helping answer all of the questions. And we hope all of you have a wonderful, wonderful day. Take care.